Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine whether the ongoing vaccination programme worldwide is getting to grips with COVID-19. Despite vaccines now having been deployed for the best part of this year, worldwide daily new cases of the virus top 500,000, daily deaths over 8,000, and the total death rate is inexorably heading for 5 million. All this before the onset of winter in the heavily infected Northern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, Africa remains an unvaccinated continent with barely 5% of the population covered, while in the UK a series of bizarre policy decisions has included delaying the vaccination of teenage school children until after the school year had returned. The result across all four administrations is that the UK, with one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, also now has one of the highest rates of infectivity. Those who had hoped for early signs of a knockout blow for science over the virus looked doomed to disappointment. But is the outlook as bleak as it would at first sight appear? Well, today we speak to a world expert, Professor Luke O'Neill of Trinity College Dublin, who has emerged as one of the key commentators on the ability of vaccines to triumph over coronavirus. But first, to your tweets, messages and emails in response to our show last week on the UK Party's conference season. Patricia Clint says, no one is standing up to the Tories. Ian Bruce says, the programme is very informative. I was never important enough to be a Tory. Thanks, Edwina. John McConaughey says, Labour are too much to the right now. Of course, Chris Williamson referred to his lifelong hero, Tony Benn, in last week's show, and Eileen Newman says, Tony Benn was awesome. Michael Brownlee says, the English ship of state is holed below the waterline. The only thing stopping it from sinking completely is the amount of public money thrown at it. Gordon McKenzie says, Edwina Currie is always of great interest. Not necessarily politically or factually correct, but always entertaining. And finally, William Moore says in relation to the ship of state, ship, more like a punctured dinghy, with a captain and clueless cabinet lost at sea. Now, the vaccines are deployed, but the virus is still ripping through society. We turn to Professor Luke O'Neill of Trinity College Dublin to assess the underlying state of play in the battle between science and the virus.
Professor Luke O'Neill, what's happening worldwide? I mean, are we winning this battle with coronavirus? Are the vaccines prevailing, or are there still plenty of pitfalls to come?
Well, it's much better than it was, Alex. Think of this time last year, for instance, we're in a much better place globally. Let's start with that statement of fact. But the truth is, it's still burning away, especially in developing countries. A big concern is low vaccination rates in the poorer countries of the world. In the West, as we might call it, we're doing quite well, and Europe especially is doing very well, actually. We're getting close to a magic number. So the magic number now is if 85% are vaccinated or have been infected, that's a really good place to be, because you're now getting to the dreaded phrase herd immunity, although we don't like that phrase very much. But certainly you're getting a high level of protection in our communities, which is tremendous. And Ireland, I mean, we're top of number one in Europe. Can you believe it? We like to boast this, of course. We've become like a Scandinavian country, basically. You see, we've got to 92% of our adult population is fully vaccinated, and the UK is not doing too bad either. So many countries in Europe are doing very well.
But let's look at the UK and indeed America, which are relatively high vaccinated countries, but have high rates of the virus. And Scotland has had extremely high rates recently, and England's rates are now increasing again. So what's going on? Why is it that a high vaccinated country can still have relatively high rates of spread of the virus?
Well, you do have, in America, for example, lots of people aren't vaccinated in various parts. So very often the cases are in the unvaccinated people. The majority of cases will be in the unvaccinated, but you do see breakthrough infections in vaccinated people as well. But the good news is it's not translating into severe disease and hospitalization. So case numbers aren't especially informative, if the truth be told. The key metric here is severe disease and hospitalization. And the UK, Scotland, we're holding steady. Ireland's holding steady with that number as well. And last week, I heard an expert say the NHS has not been overwhelmed now at this stage, in this phase of it. Even though case numbers are up, that doesn't mean increased hospitalisation. That's important.
But certainly they've weakened the link between the spread of the virus and hospitalisations and, of course, deaths and mortality. But I mean, one of the chief medical advisors, Professor Whitty, just last week seemed surprised that 50% of English school children had been infected with the virus. Why on earth should that be a surprise?
I know. Yeah, he was hoping mitigation would stop that happening in a sense, because obviously schools reopened. They had various mitigation measures in place, be it distancing and ventilation and so on. Maybe his surprise was how quick that number got infected might be the thing you see. Remember, Alex, it's not a bad thing because it's a very benign disease in children. And if they get infected, they will be protected. And even more importantly, they'll be picking up Delta, the one that's more transmissible. They will now be protected from reinfection with Delta. So I didn't see that as a negative. Although you're right, though, I'm not surprised at all, are you? Because obviously, if you open the schools and you have insufficient mitigation, it will spread. It's as infectious as chickenpox. We know that now, by the way, Delta, by the way. And as you may remember with chickenpox, one class, one pupil gets it. They all get chickenpox. So it's not that surprising you're seeing that high level of infection.
But wouldn't it have been a reasonable precaution to vaccinate the secondary school children before they went back to school as opposed to afterwards?
For definite. And in Ireland, we did that. We began vaccinating the over 12s maybe 3-4 months ago now. And I think it's something like 80% of the over 12s now are fully vaccinated. That's a great number to see. And of course, they're now protected. The next question is, what about the under 12s? And she'll be back. In Ireland at the moment, actually, the main people getting infected are under 12s because they're not vaccinated, you see. So, and that tells us something, doesn't it? So whether we should now move on and vaccinate them is another question, I guess.
Still thinking about school children, there's some suggestion, certainly in the UK, that they'll only be getting one dose of the vaccine. How does that make sense, Professor O'Neill?
Yeah, it's a bit strange, Alex. I mean, in Ireland, they're getting 2 doses. I'm not quite sure why the UK went for 1 dose. I think it's because they're assuming they've been infected, strangely, is one possibility. In other words, you've been infected, that's like your first shot, and then you get your first shot is like your second shot in a way. That may be the reason for that. But it was an interesting decision. It could have been a spare vaccine to give it away, maybe to the developing world, you never know. But in Ireland, we give 2 shots in that age group.
Is it possible, to choose from all this range of vaccines which have become available in record quick time? Is there 1 or 2 emerging as the clear front runners in terms of being efficacious? Is there a medicinal compound which is efficacious in every case? Yeah, there is, Alex. I mean, the data is amazing. I mean, we've never studied a virus as much as this one in history. The amount of knowledge we have in the past 18 months on the SARS-CoV-2 virus is remarkable. Let's start with that. So the science we have behind this is tremendous. And then the vaccine deployment, they're measuring vaccine performance in the field. So something like 5 billion people in the world, there's a number for you, have had 1 shot. Isn't that amazing? And then many have had 2 shots of the different vaccines. Now, we know that there's a league table, Alex, to be honest. Moderna seems to be number 1 in terms of performance. Then we have Pfizer. The RNA vaccines are really performing extremely well. And then we have what I call the adenoviral vaccines. That's AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. So they're less effective than the RNA. They're still okay. I mean, they're still giving 60, 70% protection. But what's really great if you're an immunologist is we may have come up with a technology for any disease now, any infectious disease, using RNA as the technology. And as we speak, Alex, there's a trial running on HIV with an RNA vaccine now. So in other words, they managed to devise a technology against COVID, a very powerful vaccine, and that same technology can now be used with other infectious diseases, which still remain a huge problem. Malaria is on the list next, TB is still a big problem. So in other words, the RNA vaccines are definitely top of the class. And have we got the same level of statistics across the world? I mean, how is the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik, getting on? How's the Chinese vaccines? How are they performing worldwide? They're quite similar to AstraZeneca. They're like old-fashioned, if you like, almost technologies. So it looks as if those older-fashioned approaches, they're still working. We still use those technologies in different vaccines, but the RNA vaccines, the novel ones, if you like, are outperforming them. And the second concern we have is waning immunity. So which of them is waning faster? And there's no doubt that Pfizer and Moderna are holding up more than the others in terms of less waning. Again, that's more evidence that they're more powerful as vaccines. And for these more traditional vaccines, can that be dealt with by the so-called booster jab? That's the third. Is there evidence that once you get to that, then you have effective, perhaps not complete, but effective immunity? There is great data, again, like they're giving Pfizer after AstraZeneca, say, or vice versa, and so on across the board. It's called heterologous immunization is the fancy name for this, by the way. You change the vaccine with their second shot, Now, heterologous is always better. You seem to desensitize a bit to the first shot.
So if you give the same shot again, you're slightly less, give a different shot, you get a better response. And the data holds up on that one. And it looks as if the AstraZeneca followed by an RNA vaccine, that's a really good combination. And you get a very strong response then. And I believe, I'm not what situations in Scotland or in the UK, but in other countries, they're only using RNA vaccines as the booster shot because they know it works better than giving AstraZeneca as a boost.
In the case of vaccine, it's a good idea to mix your drinks. Is that what you're saying?
It is. Very good one. Absolutely. Yeah, mix the grape and the grain and you'll be all right. In this case, you might be better off.
And how is it that even if you've had 2 vaccine shots, you can still end up in hospital? I think lots of people find that very difficult to understand.
Sure. Well, some vaccines don't work in that individual for some reason. Any medicine will show variation in its effectiveness between a whole lot of people, So sadly, some are fully vaccinated, and for some reason, the vaccine hasn't worked in them, and that can happen. It can because they're immunodeficient already for some reason or whatever it might be. And the ones who die, sadly, they often have other diseases as well. There's underlying conditions there that make them especially vulnerable, So in other words, nothing works 100% ever in life, does that? Put it that way. If they did, we'd be happy. So sadly, there's a small minority who do actually end up in hospital having been vaccinated.
For somebody in your field, obviously this has been a comprehensive human tragedy across the planet. But you referenced that we've got this unbelievable data. In your professional career, did you ever believe that in your discipline you would have such an amazing mass of extraordinary data about any illness, about any virus?
Yeah, it's staggering, Alex, staggering. It was obviously well justified. Here we got the biggest pandemic in 100 years, Everybody put their shoulder to the wheel. All the drug companies, many academic, my own lab, we switched into COVID to work on specifically because of this, you see. I was at a conference last week in Germany, my first conference in a year and a half. Can you believe it? Face to face, the excitement was tremendous. Every talk about COVID in the bar, in the restaurants, all these immunologists, COVID, obviously for good reasons. And that's yielding all this information. So now we have a tremendous body of data about coronaviruses in general. We've got new ways to deploy vaccines. That's the most applicable thing we have. The third thing, Alex, is new therapies, remember, because people often forget they've got better in hospitals at treating patients. The survival rate's gone up as well. And there's 7 new therapeutics approved for use in hospitals if you end up in hospital with COVID. And again, that was all this massive effort. Now, clearly, this was going on before COVID. We learned a huge amount about other viruses, about the immune system over decades. And in a sense, we were able to deploy that knowledge and then learn even more in the past 18 months. So it is a remarkable achievement for science, really.
Professor Luke O'Neill, when we come back in a few minutes, we'll look at some of these new therapies and see how effective they are.
Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with Professor Luke O'Neill.
Professor O'Neill, you mentioned how much more effective treatments were. Now, the famous one that President Trump was administered in an experimental phase, which seemed to work wonders for the president. Is that the sort of treatment that's coming through?
It is. That's number one, Alex. So that's called antibody therapies, monoclonal antibodies, to give it its full name. And what they are, they're antibodies you inject into your body against a spike protein, and they mop up the spike and then stop the virus sticking into your lungs, And it's been used in lots of diseases in the past. They were experimental when they came out, when Trump took them, but they're decreasing death by 70%. It's incredible. And there's 2 types, one by Regeneron, the other by Lilly, and they're approved in the UK by the NHS, for example. So they're a huge advantage. Now, the problem with them is they're very expensive. They cost €2,000 a shot, for example. They take 90 minutes to infuse, so it's a bit laborious, you see. But yet again, someone in hospital, serious disease, the doctors can now give them those antibody therapies. And Trump was at a phase when they were still experimental. We knew they'd work, by the way, because we knew this is a very effective way to stop the virus, you see. The vaccines, of course, bring them out anyway. And here's an interesting one. So anti-vaxxers in America won't take the vaccine, but they will take the antibody if they end up in hospital. And it's costing 100 times the price. Isn't that amazing, you see? So that's a puzzle to doctors in America, because they'd have the same concerns about the antibodies as about the vaccine, and yet they're taking the antibodies. So it's a strange one. But certainly those antibodies are a huge add-on.
Are you saying if the former president was still allowed to tweet that he'd be saying how he saved the planet at an experimental level?
Yes, I suspect he claimed success himself. He probably says he invented them, did he? I don't know, but certainly They're a really important thing. The trouble is they divert nurses away from other parts. In the US at the moment, in the southern US states, it's rampant there, basically, and the vaccine level is quite low, but they are using up all the antibodies. It's a strange one, you see. So the question is, can the companies make more of them? Will the price come down and so on? Because you want people to get access to these medicines, obviously, if they end up really sick.
Is it a danger, Luke O'Neill, that with the effectiveness of the vaccine, that once people get their 2 jags and even their 3 jags, that they lose all sight of the public health measures, the more traditional way, the ancient way of tackling disease outbreaks? I think all of us will have been to events recently, perhaps not medical conferences like the one you mentioned, but other social events where we find ourselves the only people who are wearing masks, for example.
Yeah, no, it's true. There's a bit of complacency begins to set in a sense, you know. Now, it's understandable because remember, this is your shield. If you're vaccinated, you are now huge protection against this virus. It's tremendous, you know. So people are going to go, oh, look, to hell with this. I'm just going to get my life back in a sense, you know. But for this next phase, especially as we enter the winter, still a bit of caution we need because there's many unvaccinated, including all the children, some vulnerable people, and the waning issue is still there. We're still very much in the middle of it. And remember, it's a respiratory disease. And we know colds and flu spread in winter. So the worry we have now is there could be some kind of surge in the winter. So again, we need to be cautious in the coming months. Get to spring, different story, because we're out of the winter then, and then maybe we can really begin to think about relaxing all the measures.
And the traditional enemies and viruses, the colds and flus, I mean, I saw some Twitter traffic in the conference season with some journalists whining that they'd got a heavy cold at conferences, not coronavirus, but a more traditional infection. How do these traditional infections interact with a major viral spread? Does that make you more vulnerable or less vulnerable to these?
We think people are what we call naive to those viruses now because they have been out and about for months and months on end, you know? In other words, last winter, we all stayed home. We didn't catch these things and our immunity began to fade. I mean, it's a strange business, but sometimes immunity does go. Now, this winter, we're back out in the field, if you will, and now we start catching them again, and it might be slightly more severe because you've no defence or limited defence against them. So one prediction is we will see more severe colds. Now, colds aren't a worry, it's just a bit of a nuisance, you know, but it's the flu you want to watch for next. And one of the worries we have is there could be an uptick in flu cases again, simply because people have lost their immunity to some extent against the flu. So again, the advice, Alex, is very simple. Get your flu jab. If you're over a certain age and in a vulnerable category, get the flu jab and get your booster with COVID at the same time. And that's actually happening. We're seeing, in fact, some companies are putting the 2 shots in one to make it easy, you see. So flu is an important consideration coming into the winter.
So I should be asking my own physician over the next few weeks if I can get 1 shot rather than 1 in either arm. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 2 for the price of 1 if you're lucky. You never know.
Turning to the serious position worldwide, even more serious position. I mean, Africa as a continent has a level of about 5% vaccination at the present moment. Rather than 95% vaccinated, it's 95% unvaccinated. How severe a threat that is to the whole of humanity that such a continent is unvaccinated?
It's a huge, it's the big issue now, actually. The last remaining significant concern is extra variants cropping up and coming back to haunt us, if you will, you see. And they could crop up in Africa. A variant happens because the virus divides and makes a mistake, and you get a slightly different virus. And it's a random process, by the way. It's a bit like, you know, rolling the dice. Sometimes you roll the dice and you get a nasty variant. Delta is much more transmissible, for example. So the way to stop the variants is to get the viral count down in people, and that's the vaccination program. So we must get vaccines to those developing countries. The second, even more important reason is it's ethical. There's people dying in those countries of COVID who would be protected with vaccination, like healthcare workers, vulnerable people, and so on. So we must get the vaccine out. Now, everybody knows this. Governments are donating lots of vaccine. The US actually is about to give 500 million doses away again, and the UK is as well. So we are aware of this. But now it's a case of mobilizing that and making sure we get as much vaccine as possible into those developing countries.
And isn't that more of a logistical question than even a manufacturing question? Maybe a question of licensing manufacturing in other countries. But the key question is logistics, the sort of logistics that humankind seem quite capable of mobilizing for warfare. That logistical support seems beyond us for for distributing vaccine. Why is that?
It does. Now they are aware of that as well. So I think the global production in the next 12 months will be 22 billion doses of the vaccines will be made. Now, that's more than enough to vaccinate the world. So the question is, get it into the trucks, get out there, get out to these remote places and so on. And they're aware of that. But you're quite right. It becomes a logistical exercise. Now, we did it before with smallpox, in that we got that vaccine all over the world, eliminated that virus. We've almost done with polio in Africa now. Africa's polio free. And again, that was just simply getting the vaccine into all these different places, so it can be done. And now more than ever with this, we must do it. Because can you imagine if a new variant cropped up that dodged the vaccine? We're back to square one. Now we can get another vaccine going, of course we can. But then can you imagine the psychological effect, the economic effect? So it's a really important issue to get these vaccines out. One suggestion, Alex, is to build factories in these countries to make the vaccine, you see. And that's a possibility. They're discussing that now in Nigeria, for example. It takes a few months to build one of these plants because they're quite elaborate, obviously. India can make billions of doses already. They've got very elaborate production there for the vaccines. So the future may well be building places in these countries to make sure supply is not an issue. And again, if it's local, it gets out much more quickly.
So if production's not really the issue, it's more distribution and logistics, then it is a false trade-off. Is it not, to say there's a balance between a booster jab in the developed countries and any jab in the developing countries? It's more a question of the developed countries getting their act together and getting jabs into the arms of people worldwide.
Absolutely. Now, the dilemma now is, should you give a child the vaccine when that child has minimal chance of dying, or give that vaccine to someone who's got a high risk of dying, and that person might be an older person in the developing world, you see? The ethical answer is give it to the person who's at risk of dying, not the one who isn't, So in other words, if supply is not an issue, we should get everybody done, But if supply is an issue, you shouldn't give it to children ahead of someone who's much more vulnerable. Ethically, that would be unsound, you see, and that's the debate we're having. I mean, they are saying, I saw Tony Fauci, the famous American immunologist, say last week, he said, do it in parallel. You must do this in parallel. Don't just do the boosters in America. Make sure for every booster you give a shot to a developing country, and that hopefully will happen. The question is, Alex, will they do it, I suppose? Will they manage to do this or not, you see? That's the question that we now have.
Now, we've seen, as you've described, giant leaps for humankind, both in the development and rapid quick time of vaccines and in the better treatment, the acute treatment for COVID. Are there further steps to come? Are there yet more technologies which are going to be devised, which will give us an even better chance of defeating this ancient enemy?
Well, you won't believe it. It could be the RNA vaccines are so fantastic. They're as good as it's going to get. And it's very good, by the way, So we may well have not quite stumbled into it, but certainly there's a bit of serendipity in science, as you may know as well. So we've managed to make these RNA vaccines, and they seem to be fantastic. So if this holds up, we will now deploy those RNA vaccines against other infectious diseases, even cancer. I mean, BioNTech, the company which gave the vaccine to Pfizer, they were actually going after cancer originally to make a vaccine for cancer. Can you imagine? So there's huge optimism among immunologists that we now finally get vaccines for things that we need vaccines for, you see. Now, the therapeutics, we need to do better. Now, even though that 70% is a great number, they're still very expensive, they're hard to make, So we may see a better sort of production situation, perhaps for those antibodies is one option. And then second, in my own area is anti-inflammatories. We're trying to develop much more potent ways to suppress inflammation in the lungs in COVID, for example. Those drugs could suppress inflammation in other lung diseases like emphysema, for example. So in other words, we're going to get spit. My analogy, Alex, like the moonshot. Remember we got Teflon or something from the moonshot? We could get technologies from this that would be deployed in lots of different contexts. And I think we're going to look at it like the Second World War in a way. That gave rise to loads of new technologies that were applicable across different areas. The COVID crisis, I'm sure, we'll look back and go, oh, that came out of that crisis, and can be used in different ways.
So can I pin you down on this? What you're saying is because of the extent of the technical breakthroughs, the fact that we know from the large sample of application of the vaccinations, from the significantly and increasing sample of the treatment, that the medical breakthroughs are such that these will be applicable to other diseases, to other conditions that we've been unable to defeat in the past, but these may be breakthroughs for the future.
That's the hope, exactly. Look at malaria, Alex. I mean, there is a disease that devastates Africa, you know? We've spent decades trying to get a vaccine, and now we're seeing progress. You know, if we can get rid of malaria from Africa, it has massive economic benefits because, you know, that because all kinds of, on the health of the nation is better, people are getting sick and so on, you know? So for the first time, maybe that's overstating it. We've been optimistic about malaria for a few years, actually. But now it's within our grasp to develop vaccines for very important infectious diseases and now deploy them. And your previous question, Alex, it was a question of getting them out. You know, can you get the vaccine out to these people or not? You know, and with COVID, if we lay down the tracks to get out, you know, the vaccines out, that may be soluble as well.
So coronavirus, extraordinary pandemic, huge number of casualties worldwide, but the end result may be a giant leap in science.
Yeah, that's the hope, Alex, for definite. And again, you've got to give credit to many years investment into research with the Wellcome Trust in the UK, for example, the NIH in the US. They were all, you know, taxpayers' money often was spent. We're now seeing that coming good in a way, because if we didn't have these vaccines, Alex, we'd be in a really bad way with COVID. You'd be looking at an awful lot more death and destruction, and thankfully that's not the case. And it builds on all those years of research, really.
Professor Luke O'Neill, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Alex.
In recent weeks, two of the highest vaccinated countries in the world, the US and the UK, have recorded the highest rates of coronavirus. It is true that the vaccines have weakened the link between infection and hospitalisations, but the US is still recording the highest number of deaths in the world at over 10,000 per week, while the UK has one of the highest infectivity rates per head of population. The almost blasé reaction of substantial sections of the population and media to this continuing level of infection and loss speaks to people bridling under societal restrictions. However, both countries are heading into a northern winter where conditions are conducive not just to coronavirus, but to other winter killers. And both countries have health services already buckling under the pressure of the virus. In these circumstances, the move to booster vaccine shots and further protection from other therapies, such as the antibody cocktail developed by Regeneron, is understandable. Other policy decisions, however, seem inexplicable. With many parts of the planet still largely unvaccinated, any suggestion that humanity's battle against COVID-19 is nearly won look premature to the extent of foolhardy. But for now, for Alex and myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay very safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.